A Diverse Life, the podcast in which we explore life in all its diversity. Hello and welcome to A Diverse Life podcast number 5. And in today's episode, it's all about me. Richard's going to be interviewing me about my work with theatre and prisons. So without further ado, over to Richard.
So Ian, do you want to start by just giving us a little bit of a background on yourself and the Face Up Theatre and how you ended up doing what you do now?
Well, to go right back, I'm an actor, so I trained as an actor, and after going to drama school, started work as an actor, doing various bits and pieces. I did quite a lot of sort of touring theatre work, and that involved work in schools and street theatre festivals, and a variety of things like that, as well as just working in bars and everything that a young actor has to do. And I came across an organisation called Geese Theatre, who geese as in the birds, and they were recruiting actors. And I looked at it, and initially I was like, oh, I don't know about that. And then I looked further at what they did, and they work almost entirely within the prison system, and everything they do is around criminal justice. So it's around offending behaviour, working with different offenders, and also working with young people or adults who might be at risk of offending. And they use theatre and drama as a way of working. So I worked for them for 5 years, touring after auditioning and everything like that. I worked with them for 5 years, touring prisons and working within the probation service and working with a whole host of different people within offending institutions, really, offending behaviour institutions. And it was fascinating work. I absolutely loved it. And they used some really specific ways of working. All of the theatre and drama that they created and all the workshops that they did with men and women in prisons, all sort of focused on how an individual can maybe sort of oppressing themselves through their choices. So if what you're choosing to do is abuse drugs or use violence or steal from other people and fundamentally break the law, for most people, except a few incredible sort of criminals that get away with it, most people that commit crime get caught quite quickly and end up spending most of their lives in poverty and poor health and poor education. And so really, what the theatre company often did is we would reflect the experiences of those people back at them. So using theatre as a mirror, really, and the characters in the play would be representing the people in the audience, and they would look at their lives played back to them. And part of that was getting them to think about, actually, if I continue to make these decisions, what's the outcome for me? Am I really getting the life that I want? And it was a really, really powerful way of working. And I thought, actually, this way of working is applicable to lots of different settings. And I know that people use theatre, within hospitals, so for health, looking at mental health in those kind of environments, and also within schools. Theatre and education is something that's been around for a very long time. It's very successful with children. So I thought, well, I want to go and do this work. It was time for me to leave. I'd been working there for a very long time. I was leaving the area and also wanted to move on and try new things. So I took all the skills that I had there and went and started to employ that within other settings. Initially working quite a lot within schools, but then more and more I realised that you could use this with people in business, people within organisations, really anywhere where people are coming into contact with other people, there will be issues at play. And these ways of working are really useful in those areas. So that's kind of it, really. That's how I ended up starting the company and ended up doing a lot of the work that I do now.
So I think that's really interesting, because one of the reasons that you and I started working together and sort of facilitating training courses together was because you had that sort of different delivery style to me and that different sort of life experience. So obviously I can do the sort of diversity training and the sort of disability things, but what you could do from a sort of acting point of view was the sort of interactive things and the role play side of it. One of the things that we've sort of covered before in our sort of mental health training as well has been the sort of factors that lead to difficulties with mental health. So if it's an issue around housing, not having secure employment or not having access to money and sort of financial worries, do you think from your experience of sort of working in the prisons, do you think that that's somewhere that we perhaps as a society let offenders down when they're released? Because I see quite a lot about sort of reoffending rates and, people are leaving prisons and then almost going straight back in. Do you think, that there's a sort of responsibility on us as a society or at sort of government level to actually make sure that when we're releasing these people, not only are they ready to be released in terms of a sort of rehabilitation point of view, but actually we're giving them the tools and the things that they need to give them the best chance?
Yeah, I mean, I can only talk from my experience, and in the times that I was working in prisons, and I still do occasionally work in prisons. And I certainly during that time you met. I mean, even imagining that I wasn't in the same prison every day of the week, I'd be in lots of different prisons across the nation. But I still had experiences over the course of the 5 years where I would go back and see somebody that I'd worked with 2 years previously who were now on a different sentence. And this wasn't an unusual thing to happen. So I think that um, that regularly happens. People talk about the revolving door of the prison system, and it particularly happens with those people who are maybe slightly younger in their age group, not always the case, but speaking broadly, younger, serving shorter sentences, so sentences that may be between 2 to 4 to 6 years inside. So somebody going in maybe at 20 and coming out again at 22, they're still maybe not mature enough or have had the experience of life to change their life patterns. So often what happens is they're released straight back into the community that they left, which means straight back to the same mates, the same sort of people that were getting them into trouble before. And you're absolutely right, quite often straight back into quite a precarious situation where they don't have housing. And now if they also had a drug problem, which is quite often the case, they would leave prison. Maybe they've got clean while they've been inside because, not in all prisons. We know that prisons have a lot of problems keeping drugs out. However, some men do manage to get inside and get clean. They go on a rehabilitation program. And so they may be clean inside. They'll come out, but immediately, as soon as they come out, they are presented with their history. They're presented with all of their old mates. They may be presented with old girlfriends or partners that they've fallen out with. They're presented with their family. And, we know that these people may well have had difficult upbringings and they may have trauma in their life because of their upbringings. So what do they do when they face all of that, when they get out of prison and they think, God, not even got anywhere to stay? I think most people, if they're going to end up sleeping rough, I think they'd rather sleep rough off their heads on drugs than sleeping rough, stone cold sober. And that's what they do. And of course, that leads to offending again. And because they already have a criminal record, they are sent straight back to prison. But again, it might only be a petty crime. So they are only in for 6 months to a year and then they're straight out. And one of the biggest things that I noticed, so I worked with men that have committed all offences and some women. When I initially started doing that work, I was really scared of going to prisons and meeting people that had murdered other people or committed, abhorrent acts. I was really worried about that. But actually what I realised is when I met those people, I wasn't really allowed to work with them until they'd at least moved on slightly in their sentence. And you meet those prisoners who go through the whole system, hopefully, I don't know if that's still the case, and you might meet them in an open prison where actually they've spent 15 years in prison and they are now beginning to go out on a temporary license and they spent a long time working on their issues. And those guys are, I would say, far less likely to recommit certainly another murder having left prison. There are psychopaths, but they're quite few, really. Most of the people that committed murder in prison have done it through violent crime that's gone wrong, or because they've just lost it, or because they were off their mind on drugs and they did something. So when they come to terms with that and they move on, they're less likely to reoffend. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, absolutely. Right now, we're not doing enough, and I think that what we've done over the past few years is we've built bigger and bigger prisons, and because those prisons are so big, and because they've had to reduce staffing and privatise some of the prisons, the my sense is that it's harder to look after individual people within a bigger system. You think about if you went to a massive school, it's quite hard for those teachers with big class sizes to focus on the specific needs of individual pupils, especially if those pupils or prisoners have considerable difficulties to overcome. So yeah, we're in a difficult place, and it does need to change radically, really.
I mean, I've seen a few sort of suggestions in terms of what might be possible. So one of the things that I read about this week actually was a suggestion from the sort of illegal side and the magistrate saying that what they might do is not sort of encourage lower sentences. So they would remove any sentences that were under 8 weeks, for example, in favour of community-based work and sort of community orders, because the research that they were sort of looking at has suggested that, a sentence of 8 weeks, for example, is quite disruptive to the family and the sort of children that might be connected to the person who is being sentenced, but also from a sort of reoffending rate. Sending somebody to prison for 8 weeks or so wasn't actually, it was that revolving door. The 8 week sentence wasn't doing an awful lot to reduce reoffending rates. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Uh, Absolutely, and I think one of the biggest travesties of prison is what it does to families. I mean, there's been some brilliant projects in prisons. There was a particular project called Storybook Dads, which focused on working with fathers inside and getting them to look at stories and read stories, and eventually they would read a storybook and it would be recorded, and that recording would go to their children so their children could listen to that at bedtime. And that was really powerful. But through the process of doing that recording, I know that the team working on that would spend a lot of time talking about parenting, talking about those offenders' own experience of parenting, and really kind of asking them how they do things differently. But those would have been guys on longer sentences. That wouldn't have happened to somebody that was doing 8 weeks. And I think 8 weeks is just probably enough time to maybe start a drug habit, or meet some people that connect you with some criminal groups outside of the prison, or maybe fall into some bullying or some blackmail, or some kind of abuse during your time in there. So really, we're taking people that are already got problems, and we're potentially presenting them with more problems by putting them inside for such a short period of time.
It's interesting what you're saying there about putting people in contact with or connecting with, other criminal groups that they perhaps wouldn't have known of before. I watched a documentary I think it was over the last bank holiday weekend, about the Hatton Garden heist or robbery that was a few years ago. And it was interesting, obviously that's quite an extreme crime. I think in the end it was sort of £14 million worth of bits and pieces that they managed to take out. But the interesting thing was...
Yeah, it's quite unusual. Can I just say something on that as well? Just because I think this is one thing that people don't realise. They think about offenders and they think about prison, and what they do is they totally think of the Great Train Robbery, Ronnie Biggs. They think about these kind of gangsters that have done really well almost out of being a criminal. But what they don't realise is if you go into a prison, what you're fundamentally surrounded by. So listen to this, kids. If you were thinking prison might be good fun, right? The biggest issue with prison is you're going to be bored. You're going to be surrounded by people who fundamentally are struggling. They're having a hard time. They're not they're not career criminals. They're not people that are gonna going to make millions of pounds through drug dealing or through bank robbery, and I think people get the wrong picture of that. And it's really important to remember that 90% of the people in prison are not like that.
No, I mean, I think it was interesting for two reasons that sort of Hatton Garden example was one, that it almost glorified crime. So there was, there were people sort of saying, well, I hope they get away with it, and what a brave thing or a fantastic thing to have done. You have to remember that the things that they've stolen from people, in one case there was a small jeweller's where they'd stolen the stock that was his livestock, that was his business, that was his way of feeding his family. So, there was a little bit of sort of media sensationalising around what they'd done that I sort of felt a bit uncomfortable with, because at the end of that crime, there are small businesses, there are people that have lost things, they've lost their livelihood because of that. But the other thing I thought was quite interesting was they were saying that, the majority of the people involved in that particular crime were career criminals. This was by a long way not the first thing that they'd done. But actually, two of them wouldn't have known each other at all had they not have met in prison, 20 years earlier. And I just thought, well, that's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Because we've put them in this environment, and he only knows that this person's very good at alarms and cracking safes and everything else because he's met him in a prison. So, did the idea for that crime or that friendship or that relationship, did that come purely from being incarcerated at the same time?
Yeah, potentially that did. I think that is a case. And I think that what you're saying is really interesting about glorifying certain kinds of crime. And I don't think people do that on purpose, but I'm pretty sure that most people place crimes within a hierarchy. So, they will place a bank robber. And this is just so you know, when you go into prison, there's a hierarchy of offenders within a prison setting. So the highest of the tree are the big-time drug dealers and the bank robbers, and they're the guys who usually have a bit more weight, a bit more power, a bit more money, and they sort of throw their weight about and tend to get a bit more respect. Then you drop down that to kind of burglary, and then the sort of the drug users or junkies or whatever phrase you wanted to use to describe them are further down the list, and then you have domestic violence perpetrators and sex offenders right down at the bottom. Because this is strange sort of old school hierarchy around offending. Now, I'm not going to get into an argument about what's worse or what harms more people, but, I think because we as a society have a hierarchy around those things about what we think is the cooler. If we were going to make a cool film, we'd probably make it about bank robbery, wouldn't we? Because there'd be lots of action and lots of car chases and all of that kind of stuff. We probably wouldn't make it about a drug dealer that's trying to feed a drug user that's trying to feed his habit. Or if we did, we'd sensationalize it. So I think all of that feeds into making prisons a much more hostile place, especially for those that are more vulnerable, whose background has been such that they have had more challenges in their life, and therefore they've got addicted to drugs, or they've, committed offences out of their mind that they deeply regret. It's a very difficult place, really, I think, in that sense, and I do think it does need to be dealt with differently, but people don't. I don't know. It's interesting, Richard, that you're asking these questions. I know it's not something that you've been involved with particularly, and I think people do tend to want to wash their hands of offenders. They want them to disappear, because I think it's a challenge to us. If we see behaviour like that, we want to push it away because we're worried about the part of us that might have been close to the edge at doing something like that ourselves. We've all lost our temper. We've all at some point said something to somebody we regretted, and most of the time, we've managed to walk away at the right moment, or we've kept ourselves calm. But I'm sure most people have been close to doing something that could have gone wrong, and they could have found themselves in a prison setting.
I think it's interesting what you say there about wanting to wash your hands of offenders or people that have gone down that path. What sort of advice would you have for an employer or a business person that's maybe thinking about employing an ex-offender, based on what you've seen and what you've said there? What do you think the obstacles are for these people when they come out of prison and they're trying to get a job? Because my sort of thought process, and maybe I'm wrong, has always been that actually if somebody was released from prison and they are given a job, they're given an opportunity to earn money and therefore, pay rent and sort of get a roof over their head, I always think that would make a massive difference to the individual and their chances of reoffending. But if you are a person who has come out of prison and you're in front of an employer, you probably are going to get some bias and some discrimination based on your past. So what advice can we give to people if they are thinking about employing somebody with a criminal record?
I think that if somebody has got to that stage that they've come to a job interview and they really are actively trying to get work, then that they mean it. They want it to happen. They're not that you'll be able to tell when you're interviewing somebody. You'll be able to tell if this person is enthusiastic and if they're really thinking about it. And I think if they're not, if they're just doing it because their probation officer has told them you've got to try and apply for some jobs, then you'll also know that because it won't feel authentic. And I would say I'd say give those people a chance if it feels like they're right, if it feels like they're right for the job. And I think if it's someone that really wants to get on with their life, they'll work hard for you. They really will. They really want to prove themselves. But remember, get to know them. Get to know their life. And don't be afraid to ask them questions about what's happened and how have you got to this place? And maybe say to them, what's different now then? I know that you've been in, these guys, if they've been in prison for a long time, with the state of the prison system at the moment and the lack of investment, they won't have had a chance to do very much. It will be hard for them to go the extra mile to prove to you that they're the right person for the job. I expect in a lot of cases there will be other people turning up that maybe have done more, have got more experience. But you've got to go, well, actually, this person has been in prison for this period of time. So they're not being able to do anything and they're trying to find a way to change their life. And I would hope that people can at least give a little bit of slack for that. But, like I say, have the conversation and be open and say, I'm really worried. I can talk into you here now. I can see that you really want this job, but I'm a bit frightened and a bit worried about what will happen if, you get a customer and you're having a bit of a bad day and they start saying things to you, or maybe they're a bit rude to you. How are you going to manage those feelings that you've had in the past? And what can you tell me about that? So I suppose you've got to keep yourself safe and you've got to make sure that this person is making that change. But I think that if they really want the job, they'll be willing to be open and honest about having that conversation. If they're not being open and honest, then that's when the alarm bells need to start ringing for you. And that's when I would say to them, look, I asked you this question and you said this, and now what I've seen is this, and that doesn't feel very honest to me. And now I'm really worried about this. And because I think, there's something to survive in prison, you fundamentally have to lie to get by about yourself, about your background. Most men, when you speak to them in prison, you ask them how they survive. They just say you keep your head down. You keep yourself to yourself. You don't share personal information. And so part of their rehabilitation is to share more with other people.
Yeah, I think there's some really good points there, and it's probably a subject we could spend a lot more time on. Do you think, is there anything you'd want to say as a closing remark or a closing thought on this particular subject? I know we've got plans to cover the sort of prison and rehabilitation service again in future podcasts, but is there anything for this particular one that you think would wrap it up nicely?
I think that certainly some prisons, I know that Wandsworth in particular does a lot of things where the public are invited in. I think they also do that locally at Sudbury. I think there's a cafe there and things like that. So, take the opportunity to meet these people. And then I think if you take the opportunity to meet these people and go to these places, what you'll realise more than anything else, which is exactly what I realised when I went into prison, is that a lot of these people are just like other people. It's just that they're in prison. A Diverse Life is a Workplace Diversity Solutions and Face Up Theatre co-production brought to you today by Ian Pringle and Richard Shakespeare. Thanks for listening.